Good morning. Today is Tuesday, April 11th, 2023. This is a meeting in Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are taking up the Renewable Energy Standard, which we currently have as a draft committee bill. And for anyone who's looking for it on our website, the draft number is 23-0107. And with that, I'd like to jump right in. Good morning, Mr. Gadecki. If you could introduce yourself to the committee for the record, and then the floor is yours to talk to us about the res and the bill.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Ben Gordeski, and I'm here representing 350 Vermont, and talking about the current Vermont Renewable Energy Standard. And thank you for inviting me to speak. First, I just want to say a little bit something about me. 50 years ago, which I realize dates me a little bit, as a teenager, I became interested in renewable energy from reading Popular Science magazine. And later on, I realized how our choice of energy sources really affected our environment. I became an energy activist. I met people who were affected by nuclear power and people affected by Canadian large-scale hydro. After that, I married and had kids and became less of an activist. And then I actually got a job in solar energy, which is what I do now. Now that the kids are older, I've returned to being an activist more. Before, my goal was to make the air and water cleaner for me and my friends. Now my goal is to make the planet livable for my children, which is, it's hard to say whether it will be. Sometimes I wonder why, after all these years, renewable energy still only makes up a tiny percentage of the energy we use. Even now, when the impacts of climate change are becoming more and more obvious. Unfortunately, the current res is an example of policy that keeps the status quo in place and prevents the progress we need to make a just transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. As you might or might not be aware, the current res requires utilities to procure a very minimal amount of truly renewable energy that is new and actually replaces the use of fossil fuels and other fuels that emit greenhouse gases. The current commitment for true new renewable energy is 10% by 2032. The current res also allows many false solutions to the climate crisis to count as renewable, such as electricity generated from the burning of landfill gas, burning of biomass, and most importantly, the use of unbundled renewable energy credits, or RECs, from out-of-state already existing large hydro projects. The problem with these false solutions is that they allow utilities to claim that they are majority or 100% renewable, when in reality, these solutions do nothing to reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. There is bipartisan support for promoting electric vehicles and geothermal and heat pump technologies for space heating. All of these technologies require electricity. This puts extra pressure on our res to be promoting truly renewable energy so that our transportation and heating sectors can be truly green. We also need to phase out the use of RECs that come from outside New England, so the Vermont truly takes responsibility for its energy generation instead of expecting frontline communities in other places to host our energy projects. If Vermont was to join the other states in the Northeast and not allow RECs from out-of-state large hydro to count as renewable, it would create more demand for real new renewable energy within the New England grid and the good paying jobs it creates. It would also withdraw our support for one of the bigger examples of environmental injustice. For more than 40 years, Hydro-Quebec has been running huge store and release hydroelectric projects on the land of the Inuit and Cree tribes. These hydro projects have ruined the fishing and hunting grounds of the tribes and flood an area equal to the size of the entire state of Vermont. And we also need to reduce our use of energy. Our buildings need to be weatherized to use less energy. We need more mass transit, even in more rural parts of the state, to reduce our energy usage for transportation. And we need to promote town zoning that encourages village centers and discourages large rural properties that are not in agriculture. when people learn about how the current res really works and that their utilities are not really as green as they claim, they get angry and frustrated. Vermonters want us to make progress towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. They want to have access to solar in their communities so that they can make a difference, and they want their utilities to do their part. They also want the new good paying job opportunities that come with the sorely needed new renewable energy build out in Vermont. Real solutions require us to build new renewable energy to replace existing fossil fuel generated electricity and the other false solutions. 350 Vermont supports reforming the current res to require 60% of our electricity to come from new, truly renewable energy by 2035. This would be a mix of in-state new renewable energy and New England grid new renewable energy. We support limiting what is now called Tier 1 to the remaining 40%. We also support not allowing any new biomass electricity generating facilities to come online. This would be a good first step towards a just transition away from polluting fossil fuels and towards the clean energy future that Vermonters want. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, so any committee questions for Mr. Gadesky? Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bray. So you're representing 350 Vermont today.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to you're a dispersed leadership organization, so you don't have like one person who speaks for the organization, is my understanding, and there's kind of a diverse range of opinions. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what your testimony means in relation to the organization, because there are many times that I'll hear from someone saying that they are a 350 Vermont member, but it might not be something that another 350 Vermont member might say. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that so I can kind of weight your testimony in relation to other folks from your organization.
Great. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I should say that the leadership in 350 Vermont, there isn't one leader. The leadership is kind of horizontal, but that doesn't mean that the organization doesn't have, kind of an agreed upon point of view.
Totally. Yeah.
And I'm part of the electricity working group, and then there are some paid staff people. I'm obviously not one of them, they volunteer my time. But we kind of, between the 7 or 8 of us, we kind of sort out our thoughts about policy related to electricity and other things related to electricity. And then the board of 350 kind of gets the input, and there's a group of people that they come to a consensus about, what our point of view is.
Okay.
And then before I came to speak, it wasn't just my ideas. We kind of asked around to everyone in the electricity committee or group what they thought and incorporated into my testimony.
Okay, so it would be fair to say that you're reflecting the views of the electrical subcommittee for 350 Vermont and more broadly the values of the organization. Is that fair? Right. Okay,
exactly.
Cool. Thank you very much. Okay,
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Mr. Gadesky, can you say a little about the how you evaluate the thinking behind how local the energy is that Vermont uses? So, in-state generation versus regional generation versus, I'm not sure what the right term is to loop in Quebec, international regional generation. So can you just say a little bit more about how you're looking at those options and how you're making recommendations?
Well, the advantage, within renewable energy built in Vermont, of course, provides jobs to Vermonters. And, I work for a very small company. We have maybe 9 people. Other companies are bigger. But if there was more renewable energy being able to be built in Vermont, then there would be more jobs. And, the pay we offer is pretty good for jobs that don't require a college education. So they're good paying jobs. The reason we would include New England wide is that the grid infrastructure in Vermont isn't really, won't be ready by 2035 for more than about 30%. There's some people who are familiar with what it would take to, to build out renewable energy in Vermont. And that's kind of what they determined. 30% was kind of as far as we could go without some major shifts. So that's why the other 30% could be from Vermont or could be from the ISO New England, which is part of one, grid, as you're probably aware of. The reason for staying within New England is that we have a lot more control over the renewable energy credits. There will also, from Quebec, it's primarily large hydro. And like I said, there's an environmental injustice piece that we don't want to step over. So we don't want to have that count as renewable when it's really a travesty. First of all. Second of all, large hydro stores and releases water, unlike run-of-the-river hydro, which we have some of in Vermont. And in the storing and releasing, there's methane that gets released. So the studies have shown that the greenhouse gas emissions of large hydro are about 40% of natural gas generation. And then if it ever got to plus the other piece is that those dams already exist. So if we're buying more of our power from Hydro-Quebec or other out-of-state resources that already exist, we're not doing anything to increase the renewable energy in the world. And if we're not doing anything to increase the renewable energy, then we are, we're not making any progress. Right now, a small portion of our energy in Vermont and in the whole country comes from, renewable energy. And we need to spur the development of new renewable energy in order to really make a difference.
Great, thank you. And I realize now that I'm seeing your name up on the screen there that I had it's misspelled on my note, and so I've been mispronouncing your name. So it's G-O-R, correct? D-E-S-T-Y?
Yeah, right. No, that's okay. It won't be the first time.
Okay, all right. Any other committee questions for Mr. Gradisky? So thanks so much for joining us, and you're welcome to stay on, or if you have other stuff to do and want to take off, totally up to you.
Okay, well,
check out. That's all I'm saying.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I should get back to work, but thank you so much for the time and allowing me to speak.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
With that, we'll go to Mr. Walsh. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. For the record, Ben Edgerly Walsh. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director with BPIRG. I wanted to start by thanking the committee again for all of the incredibly hard work you did on S5. We are continuing to follow that as it progresses through the building, and we'll get back here soon. I also wanted to note before I dig into renewables, I know that the BOTA bill is also a top priority of this committee, and that is, as you know, a priority for our organization, and really appreciate the hard work you're doing.
We have a lot of connections.
We do. There's a lot. The Venn diagram with this committee is significant. I wanted to say sort of at a pretty high level on renewables at this point. I really appreciate the committee turning its attention to this issue. It, as you know, is absolutely essential, especially as we're doing a lot of work in other sectors to accelerate the pace at which we're electrifying our heating and transportation energy use. To what degree we are powering that with renewables in the electric sector is obviously critically important. And really getting new renewables built is critically important. That for us, really has become the litmus test, and I'm trying to describe it as simply as possible. How we look at it is, if policy that's about electricity generation is getting more new renewables built than would otherwise be built without that policy, it's a win from a climate standpoint. It is reducing climate pollution. If it is not getting more new renewables built than current policy, then it is not actually ultimately solving the problem the way that we need to solve it. I don't.
Can I ask a quick
Please, of
question
course.
on that one? So sometimes I hear people say, well, if there's renewable energy out there being generated and Vermont commits to purchasing it, that's Vermont's doing its job. Eventually, if that renewable energy is in short supply and there's demand for it, someone will build more renewable energy. I don't have a sense of the marketplace if there's uncommitted renewable energy available for purchase that is behind that question. But I don't know if you know the field enough to be able to say, yeah, there is renewable generation out there. It is available for contract, and it's legitimate for Vermont to go purchase that as opposed to cause new generation to be developed.
So I certainly would agree that it's legitimate for Vermont to purchase existing renewable energy. The way that we think about it is, if you look at globally or regionally, if you look at, for instance, ISO New England or the ISO New England plus the sort of surrounding area, there's not enough renewable generation to power that whole area, Vermont included, but including the rest of New England. And so everyone in that area has a responsibility to get more new renewables out there. If we could theoretically go out there and buy 100% of our energy from existing renewables, that from our perspective would be, I would argue, shirking our responsibility to get new renewables built. It would basically be saying, we're going to let that be someone else's problem. We're going to let that be something Massachusetts or Maine or New Hampshire or somewhere else figures out how to do. We're just going to do the existing renewables thing because that's sort of the first tool that you can reach for in the toolbox. And so the policy construct that we support, and you can look at a bill that's been introduced in the House for more details, but is essentially one that maintains a really significant portion of Vermont's electricity usage from existing renewables, but also at the same time gets a lot of new renewables online. That it's pairing those two things as opposed to saying we don't want any new renewables. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, we don't want to have existing renewables go offline because nobody wants them anymore. But we also don't want to not get new renewables built. It's about having a mix of the two. And our feeling is current policy does not put enough emphasis on new renewables. I'd also say that as we electrify, there's a number of reasons why it makes sense to do this sooner rather than later. If you look at the pace at which we're electrifying now, we're talking about, just to take the transportation sector, for instance, maybe about 2,000 new electric vehicles a year. By the mid-2030s, based on regulations Vermont has adopted, we're going to be seeing 30 or 40,000 new electric vehicles be put on Vermont roads every year. And that's a really significant difference. So let's get this ball rolling. Let's build or rebuild the industry so that we can start building at pace as we are electrifying more rapidly in the back half of this decade into the 2030s. The other thing that's a real sort of strike while the iron's hot moment is the Inflation Reduction Act. I spoke about that when I was in here on S5, and it is similarly, or maybe even a more important opportunity in the renewable electricity space. Because of the Inflation Reduction Act, newly constructed renewables have tax credits at 30, 4, or 40%, or in some cases even higher. And so if we get this ball rolling on building new renewables sooner rather than later, we could see the federal government, pay for a third or more of the cost of this transition in Vermont and for Vermonters. And those credits are all time limited. They start phasing out in 2033, fully phased out by, I think, 2035. And so when we think about the sort of lifespan of something like this bill that you're considering, that gets into a study and then ultimately a bill and then ultimately rulemaking, we're talking about the back half of this decade before anything can go into effect, at which point you have, substantially less than 10 years to avail Vermont of those tax credits. So from our perspective, from an economic standpoint, the sooner we can do this, the better it is going to be for Vermont in terms of the dollars you'll be able to leverage.
Sure. And just, thanks for pointing that out. And timing wise, the study and the proposed by the bill comes back really to put us in a better position to act next session. So although studies sometimes worry people, like, is this a kicking the can down the road kind of thing? From my point of view, we're really looking for better data so that we can have a better informed legislature and make decisions next session. So
I agree with that approach, and looking at the study that's laid out in this bill, I think having the Joint Fiscal Office involved makes a lot of sense as a very well respected, real impartial entity. I had a few suggestions on the study and sort of other pieces that could be combined with it, I think, for even greater effect. But definitely in agreement that sort of analysis makes sense.
sure. If I can jump in. So on
Please
the
do.
language for the study, I don't know if you're planning to get to that a little later in your testimony or.
Yeah, so I was planning on speaking to that briefly.
Sure. So we're in that mode of, I'm going to say, if people have suggestions or anything else, I say, written language like drafting, pseudo drafting, whatever it is, will be helpful because it just lets us make more rapid progress.
Absolutely. I will say at a very high level now, but that is noted, and we will definitely work to get you language.
Okay.
So at a high level, I would say the approach to the study, looking at new renewables here in Vermont, certainly makes sense. I would argue that new renewables anywhere in ISO New England also are an important component of this. It's really important that we get new renewables built here in Vermont, but ignoring the rest of ISO New England when we are part of a regional grid, as your previous witness noted, doesn't make sense from our perspective. So having a both and approach in Vermont and in the rest of New England makes a lot of sense. I'd also say that looking at, the bill speaks to or gives authority to the PUC to design new procurement programs or sort of tweak ones we've got existing. I think that's something that this study could and should look at. The standard offer was a program that was initially designed over a decade ago. That kind of program has come a long way in this country, and there are a lot of models to look at. So having a study that actually digs into that as well would make sense. And I can also suggest some language around additional specific pieces of benefits that could be looked at by the study. It sort of stays at a pretty high level on that, and I think having more specificity for the ultimate contractor could be helpful.
Sure. And that procurement language, it's open-ended, but it is there explicitly because a standard offer is winding down, and what might be their standard offer 2, or if we build new, if tier 2 is altered, does that become the replacement for standard offer because we have a mechanism? The growth in tier 2, if it goes by, for instance, a competitive bid process, so sort of standard offer equivalent in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So we just wanted to make sure that we're leaving a means of procuring as an open part of the discussion.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that authority to PUC is appropriate. I agree with everything you just said. My only point on that is having the study also look at that to give the PUC good information on how they might want to redesign that and give the legislature more information on that before the PUC, or potentially as the PUC takes that up, would be a value add to this. The other thing that I would say that I think could really strengthen the sort of study aspect of this bill is something like the legislative working group that's in S140, the energy storage bill. I'd actually even argue that those two could be combined. They're so related that having them actually be done at the same time by the same people probably makes more sense than trying to do it in parallel and have them talk to each other. And I think, and the legislative approach, I think, is a good complement to the study. It gives more of an opportunity for legislators to roll up their sleeves rather than having something just sort of laying back here in January. I think the study has an additional value over and above the working group, but that they complement each other very well. My only suggestion on the working group is that having more than one senator and one rep could make sense. There are obviously a bunch of committees that have jurisdiction. So 2, 3, something like that. But obviously that is a policy decision up to all of you.
5.
7,
No one's no.
13 is a lucky number.
The last thing that I wanted to say before I wrap, and obviously happy to take any questions you have, is, and perhaps most importantly, and I've expressed this to some of you in other contexts, doing all of this at once rather than getting a jump start on the 100% renewable requirement before understanding how to better get new renewables built makes a lot more sense to BPERG than moving on the 100% requirement before having that additional legwork done. That feels very sort of, and it's an overused phrase, but cart before the horse to me, that essentially endorses a construct that's 90% existing renewables, 10% new renewables. And that, again, as from our perspective at least, is an insufficient amount of new renewables. I understand that the bill points in a direction of ultimately having more new renewables in the mix, but I would argue that doing this all at once to design the right mix of new and existing renewables, rather than starting on that 90-10 construct and having to sort of undo that in order to get into more new renewables, would be a better approach. So I want to end just by saying thank you for digging into this. Thank you for looking at reforming our renewable energy standard. It's been almost a decade since it was created. It's time for it to be updated, and I really appreciate this committee doing this work.
Any questions for Mr. Walsh? Sarah White?
Thank you, Chair Bray. Just a question, because I know that we've had conversations about renewable energy credits and RECs and kind of the setup of them back in early days. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what your membership thinks about renewable energy credits and how they've been utilized so far by the industry.
Well, so I want to be clear that while BPERG advocates try to do our best to speak on behalf of the members, we don't regularly poll them. So I can't necessarily say want to speak with that level of specificity on behalf of our members.
Fair.
I'd say as an organization, we're not opposed to the idea of renewable energy credits. At their core, they're really about tracking the renewable energy that is generated. It's important that we have a tracking system. Renewable energy credits or certificates are not an inappropriate tracking system, but they're not all created equal, right? And so it's really about the policy underlying what renewables are being required, and the RECs are a means to an end. So you're not opposed to them as long as the policy undergirding them is actually, striking that balance and getting rid of as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be a little repetitious, so if you have language to suggest, to welcome your
Battery storage.
earliest course.
Understood.
Yeah, could we request that they bring us language on combining the battery storage piece into?
Sure, I mean, we've talked about what's the pathway for this bill, and I'm thinking that part of what we're doing is being flexible and keeping our eyes open, and we're 14 days from the end, so I'm feeling the pressure to keep moving and keep our eye on more than one thing. I think we're gonna have to be nimble from here to the finish line, but certainly welcome the idea of putting things together. Okay.
Thank you to it.
Cool. Mr. Sterling.
Batting third on res. Usually put a good hitter up. So.
Oh. You'll do. I think you know it.
Frequently in error, never in doubt. All right. All right. So thank you all for having me. Peter Sterling, Executive Director of Renewable Energy Vermont. So happy to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, renewable energy.
Good to see you.
So I'd like to, the theme that I'm talking about, or I like to raise both sides, why we need renewable energy reform. Why do we need res reform? This first slide, that picture on the right is a 360 megawatt natural gas facility in Dayville, Connecticut. It's 60 acres. I've been talking to a fellow who lives in that town. They were fighting a second plant that was going to try to be put there. And as perspective, 60 acres goes from here at the State House to the library, down to Shaw's, for those of you in Montpelier, up to National Life and back. So when Vermont does not use or deploy enough renewables, our power largely comes from natural gas plants and other fossil fuel plants in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So when you ask me, why should we even bother doing reservoir? It's so people in other parts of New England don't have to live with that, because there are 0 of those in Vermont. 0. So imagine siting a 60-acre natural gas plant in Vermont. We wouldn't do it, but we asked people in Connecticut and Massachusetts and other parts of New England who live with that. And that is why we need more renewable. That is a major reason why we need more renewable energy in Vermont. In fact, we have 9 peaker plants in Vermont that run in emergencies. Each of them run for less than 9 hours. So essentially, we burn almost no fossil fuels for our own power in Vermont. We ask, and I can get you maps of all the other plants. I have it in a later slide. I just jumped ahead. So for the next slide, our electricity isn't as sustainable as we like to believe. I mean, as load grows, when you look at this whole pie chart here, the only ones that realistically we can expand are either the New England System Mix, which is that largely natural gas, or wind and solar. We're probably not building another biomass plant in Vermont anytime soon. Our nuclear power is capped out. Probably, we're probably not the political will to buy more Hydro-Quebec, and there's really no new hydro coming online anytime soon. So as our load grows from electrifying everything, our power is either going to come from the system mix, which is largely natural gas and fossil fuels, or wind, solar, and renewables. Senator Bray, I can answer your question that you posed to Ben. This third chart, Vermont's requirement for new renewable energy is the worst in the region. So when you look at the RPSs and the other mandates other states have to buy new renewables, they are all greater than ours. So there is not a lot of unclaimed new renewables coming online. For example, Jonathan, if you haven't met him, Jonathan Dowds, the Deputy Director at REV, does a lot of amazing research with us and other things. The 1,000 megawatt wind farm that's coming online in, I'm not gonna say right, Aroostook County, Maine. 1,000 megawatts is coming online in the next couple of years in Maine, onshore wind, that's already spoken for. Largely, it's all Maine and Massachusetts power. So there aren't large chunks of new renewables that are coming online that aren't spoken for, in large part because when you look at this chart, you can see that other RPSs and other clean energy requirements are all increasing rapidly around the region. Okay, so how did we get here? Next slide.
A little bit about this chart.
Oh,
So I just want
please.
to make sure the hatched area in Vermont, or all of them, is existing renewables and clean resources. So
Yeah.
what are we referring to as clean resources?
In Vermont, other states, that Vermont doesn't have a clean resource definition where we use renewables.
Okay.
Other states do use clean, and we thought for clarity to try to get as close to apples as possible, we would call it clean or renewable. But in Vermont, we only have a definition for renewable resources.
Okay. And so
Pretty deep dive question there. I say. Read.
no, I'm just trying to make sure I know what the definitions
Okay.
mean. And then
Detail oriented.
if I look at the graph, with the total amount of clean energy in the res is similar. So I'm just trying to suss out. We have obviously a relatively low renewable piece,
New renewable.
new renewable.
That's
piece,
right.
Thank you. But total renewable puts us relatively close to our neighbors.
Right. I mean, the title of this, the point of this chart was to show the new renewables.
Yeah.
Because as Ben said, pretty well, like if we continue just to buy renewables from, let's say, old existing hydro,
Right.
we're not really doing our part to get greenhouse gases out of our region. Here's an example from my life. Let's say we had, say 6 kids, you had 6 housemates, and all 5 of them are keeping their rooms really, really clean and doing the right thing. Your room's a pigsty, food's all over the place, and now you have mice all over the place. Your housemates eventually might start to say, this is kind of BS, go clean your room, because it's affecting the rest of us.
Mice are everywhere.
The mice are everywhere. I think that's an accurate way to talk about what our low new renewables requirement is doing to other New England states. It's depressing, and I have charts that, but It's depressing the deployment of new renewables, not only in Vermont, but in other states as well.
And I would say those roommates are gonna wanna make us pay more eventually.
I mean, they'll kick you out.
Yeah. Either way.
They'll disconnect us. All right,
Be a good roommate.
exactly. Well, so a lot of the questions I asked,
Put it up there on the board after, start with yes.
yeah, some of them are my questions, and then some of them are people funnel questions.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to make sure.
No, it's totally
Like
fair.
checking in on the things that I also hear.
Yep.
From other people. Okay, thanks. Senator McDonald.
I don't disagree with your analysis. But this state at one time was started and was the first to promote renewables and to institute policies that would encourage them. And when you speak of this state as being a big, big pen, the question is, how did we go from being a beacon to start, and when did we fall off the wagon?
Yes, I have that in my upcoming slide.
Okay.
So Senator McDonald, just to be clear, is 100% spot on. And I think Asa Hopkins, who's coming up after me, will definitely talk about how we got there and how we ended up where we are. You are 100% spot on. So let me get to that. So how did we get here? Vermont's Renewable Portfolio Standard, RPS is called the Renewable Energy Standard, passed in 2015, which, as far as our understanding of the seriousness of climate change and the affordability of renewables, I would argue is like a lifetime ago. So much has changed since 2015. 75% of our retail sales have to come from renewable facilities that can deliver power to New England. That's kind of called tier 1. That's not the statute. That's what people call it. Then we have a 10% annual retail sales from sources less than 5 megawatts in state. And that is what people call tier 2. So what has worked with Vermont's RES? And this, I think, gets to Senator McDonald. When it was written, it helped incentivize the deployment of solar at a steady pace. Meeting tier 1 requirements has not had a significant rate impact, largely because of the use of unbundled RECs from large out-of-state hydro. It's provided a good transition to make renewable energy mainstream. We see solar panels on many people's houses and all those kind of things. And it has helped with economic growth. It has created jobs. That's, I would say, the main benefits of the RES. The next slide. The RES, I would argue, is not designed to address climate change. And when I went to PowerPoint school, they told me not to read things that are in writing, but that first quote from the Department of Public Service: much of the tier 1 savings are a result of purchasing RECs from existing resources. So while Vermont is reducing its fossil fuel consumption, the regional impact on incremental renewable energy is limited. Okay, so that's the department. So again, you can see the little pie chart below. Almost 100% of tier 1 requirements in Vermont are met by retiring old hydropower RECs. Right, almost 100%, 99.8% of our tier 1 requirement at the end of the day is met by retiring old hydropower RECs. These RECs are not considered renewable under the RPS of any other New England state. And so I have a graphic that will describe that on the next one. So it's important to remember the RECs from large hydro, out of region hydro, are not considered renewable under the RPS of any other New England state. So it's not up behind me. All right, so does everyone have this chart in front of them? This is kind of the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here. So and the numbers are approximate, but they're pretty close. So old Canadian New York hydro generates power. Vermont, the only state in New England, you are allowed to buy those RECs to meet your your class 1 obligation. They cost about $10. All the renewables, Senator McDonald, we're on this one. About the 5th one in. If you've been looking for it, it's about, okay. So then because we can meet our tier, the Vermont utilities, again, entirely legal. I'm not saying utilities are doing anything shady around the law, against the law, or not in the spirit of law. It's 100% legal.
Yes.
Not a problem. That is not the problem. The problem is the law, not what our utilities are doing. Just want to be clear about that. So you take a $10 REC, you satisfy your renewable energy requirement with it. That allows you to sell all of your renewables, the class 1s that are eligible, like our large wind and our solar. You sell that to other states, and that nets about $35 a REC. So all these other states are able to meet their RPS requirement using our RECs. We backfill them with RECs from old hydro. And then imagine if all of the RECs that we are selling to the other New England states would have to be kept home and retired here. because we weren't allowed to use as many of the HQ RECs and the other old hydro. Other states would have to buy other RECs from somewhere, which means new renewables would have to come online. I'm glad you all are nodding. I hope that's not falling asleep nodding, but
No, this is.
agreement,
I've-
understanding
it's not
nodding.
the first time
And again, this is the important one, right? This one at the top, old Canadian New York Hydro, not legal for any other RPS. We were the only ones that did that. And that is the part that has to change at some point. Otherwise, we are just greenwashing and we are not serious about climate change. I will caveat that if we're not serious about climate change, if we want to just feel good, we can keep doing this. We can keep the rates artificially low while we continue to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions in our region. That's a policy decision. But if our policy decision is to clean up our energy, as we ask for Monarch to electrify everything, we cannot continue to allow unbundled RECs from out-of-state hydro to be used as they are today.
Senator McDonald?
So, Mr. Chair, I'm not questioning what you are putting before us.
Yeah.
And, I was around when, as several of us were, when this came to pass, had we foreseen this, we probably would have behaved differently. How did we bumble our way into such a situation?
I think
What was the bill of goods that we eagerly
so this is my understanding, and Senator Bray was around as well. Vermont, to be honest, is the only state in New England that has an in-state purchasing requirement. And that is very good for economic development. And that is good for reliability and in grid independence and all that stuff. And my sense was that by allowing the use of unbundled RECs to be used in this way, it helped keep the rates down as we paid for what at the time was relatively more expensive power, in-state renewables. And at the time, given what people thought the cost of renewables would be moving forward, and our understanding of the climate crisis is maybe being less pressing, this seemed like a reasonable policy solution. But that has all changed. The price of solar has probably dropped, let me give a number, 70-something% since 2015, the last decade, 90% in some cases. And our understanding of the need to take quick action has also greatly accelerated, right? I mean, I know what I was thinking in 2015 on climate change. This is way more urgent right now. And I think most of us would agree. So at the time, it seemed like a reasonable policy compromise, but I think the time for changing that has come. So I don't think there's any bad intentions on any part in passing this, but.
So it was an affordable step in the right direction. I
Yes,
think was
that's
part of
right.
What happened.
That's right.
In 2015. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about back then, I'm not sure of exactly which years we're talking about, but going way back to where we essentially endorsed the state's contract with Hydro-Quebec. At that time, and I'm talking now about the early 90s, we were already thinking about global warming. And the argument for Hydro-Quebec at that point was that for all of its human rights abuses and many environmental destructive problems, that it was perceived as low carbon. And that it was, and therefore, for purposes of global warming, a green energy. As to why to count this in the RECs, I think I had been moved to another committee at that point. I don't remember the discussion. I was doing other mischief, but I think that this Hydro-Quebec, often for example, I supported all the legislation that embraced Hydro-Quebec, never liking any of it, fully aware that it was all these problems, but just with the sense of it was low carbon and it's better than nuclear. That was the kind of reductionist logic.
I mean, I think we have to be honest that it's 2023 and we don't have very many, we have no perfect energy choice left. We've made terrible decisions the last 50 or 100 years of our society. There's no great choices. Hydro-Quebec, if you need a baseload source of power that runs all the time, that can support, complement our renewables, is the best we're going to do. It is a relatively affordable much lower emissions than, honestly, if we didn't have Hydro Quebec, it'd be natural gas right now,
Mm.
or a new nuclear plant, which no one's building anywhere. So agree with Senator McCormick on that one.
Can I just do a little math check, make sure I'm keeping up on so the rec value, penny a kilowatt hour or $10 a megawatt hour for H2 power or old hydro. And then the 35, does that represent the rec price for like solar recs, high quality recs, or is that, have you already deducted the $10 out of it? Like it's sold actually at
Yeah, no,
45
that's the actual
and
rec.
it's the net
Yeah,
is
that's the-
35.
Yeah, that's a price of a class 1 rec after it's netted out.
Okay, 35. So they're
Roughly, it goes up and down. But
Yeah, but so roughly you're bringing in $35 per megawatt.
Yeah, I mean, the real point of this number, whether it goes up or down, is the giant delta between those two. That's the point. That delta doesn't get squeezed that much.
Yeah.
I mean, these recs a few years ago, the $10 were $1. I mean, but it's still a giant delta.
Right.
But great question again, deep dive.
Well, it was, so the utilities will speak for themselves later, but their pitch was, oh, well, if you allow us to do this, we're gonna use that delta and we're gonna engage in rent arbitrage. We're gonna go make that money. That money will flow to the bottom line for our in-state utilities and it will help keep in-state power cheaper to our customers.
That's right. And that is exactly right.
And that's like a
And it's been doing that.
Faustian deal, maybe.
It was, but now that the price of deploying new renewables has dropped, and you'll see in a future slide,
Okay.
so standard offer is coming in at $85 a megawatt hour. That's comparable to natural gas. I mean, we can do larger projects that's super affordable. Okay, so the next one,
When we're teeing up the study eventually, feel it coming.
wow, you really got a crystal ball right there. All right, so the next slide, just big picture accounting of recs, mass, the fossil fuel use in our electricity generation. This was Christmas Eve day in last December. It was really cold. 34% of our, 29% of our electricity came from oil as natural gas was shunted to provide home heating. You can just see, we have, recs do something different when it comes to actually learning where our power comes from. So I was going to talk about marginal generation, where power comes from the margin. I think that's not something we need to do. Let's skip to the next slide about what our coalition of environmental groups is asking.
Can I pause on
Please.
the donuts there?
Yeah,
So that's the New England grid mix.
yeah,
And
that's right.
I don't know what the Vermont mix looks like as we're off takers, but we have our own contracts. So I don't, if we were suddenly, Vermont was 34% oil fired that day, then you'd say, well, most people probably say that's a lot dirtier than we thought. I don't know how much of the generation that Vermont uses when we need marginal peak power.
Right.
Is actually grid mix compared to contract mix that might be cleaner. Do you have information on that?
We can find that out.
Follow up on
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a great question. We should get that.
Right. I mean, I'm not
Right.
questioning these.
No.
This
You're
is sort of a very
right.
general picture. I don't know if Vermont utilities buy
Right.
cleaner resources within that whole mix.
Right.
What percentage of Hydro Quebec power goes to New England? Does Vermont take?
Oh, it's tiny. Now a lot goes to Massachusetts.
So am I correct in surmising that one of the things that Hydro Quebec asked Vermont to do is, Vermont, would you please be the conduit for electricity down to Massachusetts and Connecticut? And they offered us frequent flyer miles to provide that. And we had perhaps received a lower charge for having agreed to transport their electricity through Vermont. Is that how we got into the help? Did that contribute to the situation that we're now looking at?
I can't pretend to be privy to the discussions between, the individual contracts between utilities and another utility like Hydro Quebec, but So I can't comment on that, but we certainly have a pretty good deal with Hydro-Quebec right now. There's definitely enthusiasm among some to build another power line connecting Hydro-Quebec to the rest of New England underneath Lake Champlain. It's been permitted. It's New England Clean Power Link, and might not be the worst thing to move power back and forth around between New England and Canada. We can talk about that another time. So what we're asking the legislature to do to bring sufficient new renewables online is to, and this has been being supported by every major environmental group, from CLF to 350 to VCV and VVSR and Rights and Democracy. We've all endorsed this basic construct. Replace the current Tier 1 renewable energy purchasing requirement, capping it at 40% existing renewables by 2035, increasing to 30% new renewables by 2030 generated in state, and then creating a new requirement to purchase 30% new renewables from any size of new renewables within New England by 2035. So we'll have 3 buckets: cap the existing stuff, have in-state renewables be another 30%, and then new in-region, larger, think offshore wind by 2035. That would have us at 60% new renewable energy. That would be an incredible achievement, and that would really, Vermont would really be doing a great thing to get greenhouse gases out of our region's electric mix if we were to do something like that. I only have a couple more slides. I have questions that I get hit with. So I'm on the new information, more information on res impacts, and you can look this up. But when you look at cost next year estimates, am I on the, like, did my thing skip?
No.
There was why state renewables.
Okay, yeah, my stapler fell apart. So, okay, so why increase new renewables? It's what I touched on earlier. Vermont has 81 oil and natural gas plants. Vermont has no natural gas plants and 5 oil plants that each run very, very few hours of the year. We basically are asking others to host our fossil fuel generation. Global warming means wet freezing snowstorms are more the norm. I think we've heard this from utilities a couple more than once. WEC, for example, has a $300,000 budget for emergency storm management. The Christmas snowstorm alone cost them $1.3 million. We expect that to be more the norm. And economic development, in-state renewables, we've lost about 19% of the jobs over the last 5 years. There's still over 5,600 jobs in renewables. And here's something I learned relatively recently. 500 kilowatt net metering array. When I talk to folks who do this kind of work, it's not uncommon for it to generate about $120,000 in grid upgrades, meaning the project pays to improve Vermont's grid, to connect power to the grid. It's not done on necessarily all on ratepayers' backs. It generates about $2,000 a year in state taxes, $3,000 a year in municipal taxes, and another $10,000 a year to the landowner. So when we do in-state renewables, there's more than just jobs. There's actual money being generated, for our budget.
Can you, thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that point. So you're not saying that, so when you say that it generates $120,000 in grid upgrades.
Generate isn't the perfect word. It can result in. That's not an atypical number.
Right. So it's not like it's going to now require $120,000 in grid up. It's like it's a benefit.
It's a benefit. Okay. So let's say, in other words, if Vermont needed 500 kilowatts more of power, and this project did not happen, we have to go, buy that, or the utility might have to upgrade their grid somewhere else to do their own thing. But because this is coming on as solar, they get the developer of the project to do it.
Got you.
And that is paid for by the developer. And of course, it goes back into rates eventually, but not in that same way. Right? I mean,
so there's a huge benefit to folks when we put in there's kind of an adder, or not
right,
the multiplying kind of effect almost to putting in 500 kilowatts
Yep. And even when you net meter, right? I put net metering solar on my roof, right? I paid to connect that 12 kilowatt array to the grid to pump it back in. That came out of my pocket, right? And because now I wanted solar, and that is 12 less kilowatts that otherwise would have to be done, which someone else would be paying for, but I pay for that as the consumer. So that seems like a pretty good deal for the grid writ large, right? When thousands of people are doing this.
So I don't want to stop us to pause now. Out of the $120,000 grid upgrade, the question I would have is, you utilities can weigh in on it.
Yeah.
To what degree is that a grid upgrade that they quote unquote need? Or is it the really interconnect?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't necessarily deliver a benefit to the DU. They're just saying, okay, it costs $120,000 to make the connection. And it's not, they might say, from their perspective, there's no value to that upgrade.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to sound antagonistic,
Yeah.
but
No,
I'm
it's not.
just guessing they look at that figure differently.
Sure, but load is growing.
Yeah.
We all know that. That's, I think, also very kind of different than 2015. Like, we know people are gonna start buying more and more electric cars, you know.
Trying to get.
And so if load is going to grow, power's gotta come from somewhere, and the grid will have to be modernized at some point. So yes, I would love to hear what the utilities say. Maybe they don't see it as a pure $120,000 benefit. I'm just trying to give you the scale of what happens when you do just a 500 kW array.
Yeah. And well, thanks. It is definitely helpful. And the study is aimed at, and I hope you'll help us shape that study. Like, you know, it's trying to get at this sort of value stack of, it's not just the energy itself, there's value above and beyond energy.
Okay, so I have 2 more slides, and that with this last one, more information on res impacts. I won't take a ton of time on this, but I get asked a bunch of questions about land use, about prime ag soils and forests, and just a couple real quick ones. Prime ag soils, Vermont has about 1 million acres of prime ag soils. Collectively, the PUC issued 19 CPGs on projects 250 kilowatts or larger in 2022. Less than 100 acres of prime ag soils were impacted. I hear often what will happen to farmers. I just don't see that as the big thing that is taking farmland out of production. The Farmland Information Center talks about 41,000 acres being converted over the next 20 years.
Mr. Chair.
Certainly.
And I would just add, from my work experience, what I found was in fact the exact opposite, was that many farmers were using the parts of their fields that they could not grow those types of products on to supplant their income, to maintain the other farm work that they're doing.
The last one I just wanted, when we started this, hey, what's it gonna look like to double the amount of solar data to 20% tier 2, assuming that there's no wind coming on in the next 8 or 9 years? Let's double our tier 2 to 20%. What's the land use look like? We need about 700 acres to get to our current 10% purchase in-state requirement. To double that to 20%, because a low growth will take about 2,300 acres of land total, or new land, throughout the state. That does not seem like a hair on fire number to me, to say 2,300 acres spread out around Vermont to double our in-state renewables. Many of you have heard of the UVM study that talked about residential sprawl taking about 1,500 forested acres a year. So clearly solar is much less than that. So the last one, this is the last reason, the last thing I'd like to leave you. If there was one thing you remember from this whole spiel of mine, why Vermont should do reservoir, forget Rex, forget everything else, I hope this is it. Why Vermont needs res reform. Every kilowatt hour of electricity generated by new solar in Vermont reduces the electricity generation from fossil fuel plants elsewhere in New England. This is the whole reason to do it. This is it. This is the one piece that matters. We can talk about rates and RECs and all that. This is the reason. If we care about climate change, this is the reason to do res reform now.
Thank you. I have a question about that last one.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
I'm channeling all these questions. They're not meant to be antagonistic.
They don't come across that way.
I end up hearing them. So, and because I don't, whoever's been asking me isn't here, I'm gonna pass it along. So one characterization I've heard is a concern about bringing more intermittent generation in the form of renewable online is because of its intermittency, you need to have backup power for it. It's probably going to be, if it's going to be fast spinning so that you can call on it when you need it, it may well be natural gas. So they said, well, the more renewable we build, the more of our load is going to be intermittently served by it. So you're going to have to match it with a comparable amount of probably fossil fuel, on-demand fossil fuel powered generation. So you'll end up building both systems up to a higher level. And I don't, I'm not, I don't know if that's an accurate characterization. I'm just thinking about it, trying to learn more, figure out what really happens. I have questions for that gang as well, but what do you think about that?
Well, I would really have to dig more in, but first, S140, the amazing storage study to get Vermont moving faster on storage would be a big part of that, right? You know, there's also this idea,
There's a study in this bill that talks about adding storage.
and then there is this idea that with the New England Clean Power Link, for example, to make it a two-way line between the, let's say, offshore wind off of the coast going up to Quebec, essentially making Hydro-Quebec, that whole area, the battery storage, the hydro storage for our region. So when, the wind is howling, you send the power up there and then you release the hydro when we need it. So you wouldn't need to bank on fossil fuels to be that base load stable, of course. I would also say, and it's a little bit more down the road, but at some point, if we are serious about climate change and balancing our renewables, we have to talk about bringing some wind back to Vermont. 1 3-megawatt wind tower, like up at Milton or Lowell, it takes as much energy as 30,000 solar panels. And it's, of course,
What did you say?
1 3-megawatt turbine
Yeah.
generates as much power in Vermont because of its efficiency as 30,000 solar panels, give or take where the solar panels, but it's roughly that number. And of course, the wind blows at night here, which is not a great time for solar panels. So at some point, we have to have an honest discussion, like you said, Senator Bray, if we're going to meet our climate goals, and where's that power going to come from? We can't, instead of relying on fossil fuels as that balance or base load, more wind as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great questions. We'll have some light.
It's a learning adventure, more to learn. Senator McCormick.
Oh, you're muted.
Still muted.
Sorry, okay. Yeah, it took a second to get the icon there. I want to return to the comment about how many acres of ag land there are and how many acres we need to maximize our solar potential. Like every member of the committee, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, I get a lot of statistics from constituents, and I'm never entirely sure where they come from. I suspect that some of the statistics come from the rougher neighborhoods of cyberspace. But I have gotten claims from constituents that addressing the aesthetics of basically destroying Vermont's lovely meadows by filling them all with solar collectors. And if we do anything less, then solar is really not an alternative. That claim is made. And the other is that it requires enough acreage that it's really not a viable plan for supplying our energy needs. And I would like to be able to counter that more authoritatively than just telling a constituent, well, you got to beware of your sources. If Peter, if you want to just get me and maybe the rest of the committee, if they wish, just a concentrated documentation on that issue, I'd appreciate it.
No problem. We have that, and we're happy to get it to you. Have it to you by tomorrow.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Sterling? All right,
Thank you so much.
thank you. That will go to Mr. Gifford. And no, not here, so we're gonna keep on moving. Mr. Hopkins, good morning down there in Boston, I think.
Good morning.
Good morning. So thanks for coming back in as an emeritus member of the original RES team, you and Mr. Springer, amongst others. But so I don't know how much of the conversation you've heard this morning, but I think the general tenor of the question is we got started the way we got started. We've made progress. We're thinking about how we might modify the RES going forward, and what are the pros and cons of different approaches. So I don't know if you want to, if you have prepared remarks of your own, or you want to respond to the testimony you've already heard this morning.
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and for committee for inviting me. I admit to being a very much, despite the past, at the present being very much an outsider to these conversations. my understanding of how things stand is largely from seeing little bits in the press and the fact that my parents live in Vermont, so I get a little bit of Vermont news from them. But I guess largely I guess since I don't have any particular dog in this fight, I'm happy to answer questions that you may have about the past, thoughts about particular questions you have about things going forward. I guess I don't have anything prepared because until sitting down to listen to the last hour of this, I didn't know what the subject of the conversation was necessarily going to be. So just a couple of things just to think about, channel a little bit how we were thinking 8 years ago, I guess, at this point. It seems like it can't possibly have been that long ago, but here we are. The one thing that hasn't really been mentioned here, but which was a really important part of thinking about the planning in the first go round, is tier 3 of the RES. So the one of the main purposes for why tier 1 exists and is as ambitious as it is, and why raising that towards furthermore towards 100% could make sense, is because of the impact that tier 1 has on the way the math works for tier 3. That electrification measures implemented in tier 3 get to take advantage of the relative cleanliness of the electricity overall on average from that's set through tier 1. And then there are interaction effects between tier 2 and tier 3. I know that they're having practice lived largely separately. But the fact that tier 2 RECs can count for tier 3 was an important aspect of the initial discussions. So at some early points in the discussion of the design of the RES, there was sort of one big combined distributed / electrification tier, right? Sort of tiers 2 and 3, and they got sort of separated before the ideas gelled into their final proposed form. But that interaction effect is still there. And I would say that interaction effect continues in the extent that the GHG benefits from the RES actually come in large part from tier 3 because of the things that I guess Peter was talking about. The actual drive for new renewables in the region driven by the Vermont RES is relatively small. Because the only thing that's actually driving the creation of new renewables is tier 2. It's possible that some marginal hydro plant somewhere is being kept alive by the $10 they might be getting for tier 1 REC, but that's not a major effect. So the GHG benefits depend in part on tier 3 working well, which then depends, electrification in general depends on, to some degree, on the overall cost of electricity. And so figuring out how to best allow electricity to be as affordable and stably priced as possible, there is some blend, right? There are times when renewables are definitely the thing you should have in order to have the cheapest cost electricity overall. There are other times when, depending on how much extra you have to pay for a bunch of RECs, that having a bunch of renewables is not necessarily the least the most cost-effective thing at a system-wide level, helping to keep rates lower. So there's some balance to strike there, and some level of analysis is probably required in order to figure out, inform your decision making about how to do that, how to think about striking those balances. But I guess I would, the one thing I haven't heard this morning, but I would want to remind you of, is the broader perspective of the GHG benefits from the electrification side of the ledger. Now, since 8 years ago, EVs are a much more bigger thing than they were, right? The Biden administration in the process of trying to really push us as a country towards basically EVs being the default vehicle over the next 8 to 10 years. That the cost of electricity will only be a small portion of someone's decision about what kind of car to buy in that context. The heat pump conversation is more complicated. interplay between the cost of fossil fuels and the cost of electricity and trying to decide how we're going to decarbonize a house, right, is a little bit more complicated. So just to say that some level of analysis and thinking about the whole system energy picture rather than mucking about and tweaking this and tweaking that without necessarily having really thought through all the analysis of it, says the analyst, right? I mean, it's my job to analyze things, so of course I'm going to say that you should do more analysis, but that's just that's the temperamentally how I come to be in this career. So those are just some initial thoughts from listening to this conversation, happy to answer questions about the past or speculate about the future, whatever is potentially most valuable or interesting to the members of the committee.
Okay, thank you. So let me check. Any committee questions for Mr. Hopkins? How do you look at we had a little bit of a discussion earlier this morning about to what degree might Vermont drive the development of more renewable energy in the New England region, in-state versus just purchasing in regionally. So if we're calling it, if we said it's quote unquote local energy, whatever, to use another term, and we say that locally Vermont plus New England, do you have any thoughts about to what degree Vermont altering tier 2 has a positive impact on Vermont and or the region itself, a rate of deployment of new renewable energy?
Yeah, that last line on Peter's slides is absolutely true. That additional kilowatt hour of renewable electricity generated in Vermont displaces a kilowatt hour of fossil fuel electricity. There are a handful of occasions in which that's not true, but that's that's true. A very large fraction of the time. That statement is also true of an incremental kilowatt hour of electricity produced anywhere else in New England, or produced in a neighboring state and imported into New England. And so, the question of balancing in-state versus out-of-state is, there's a cost and an economic development question. Offshore wind resources, large wind farms in northern Maine, et cetera, right? Places where you can cite larger renewables cited in Vermont that were too big to count for tier 2, but there's a whole bunch of different kinds of resources that really I think should all be on the table to think about balancing what can get built by when, what can get cited at what cost. The in-state piece, I will say, I'm not a whatever Commerce Clause expert, right? But the in-state piece really has to be was explicitly hooked in the first res to system benefits on the Vermont grid, right? And so to the extent that that is expanded, I would feel more secure from a legal standpoint, speaking as a non-lawyer, but worried about what lawyers might do. That to figure out how to hook that, because we just want to create jobs in our state is not generally a good enough reason from a Commerce Clause standpoint, right? So hooking things to the grid upgrade costs, avoided, the value of resilience, other things that are local concrete benefits that are distinct from we just want to make jobs in our state is likely something to think about and try to get carefully right. If you were going to think about expanding tier 2, I heard some discussion of combining analysis of tier 2 with discussions of energy storage. I think that's potentially a fruitful way to think about that from the standpoint of local benefits that are about making the grid work better. That coupling the thinking about storage with thinking about in-state generation, on-site renewables coupled with storage are going to have all sorts of benefits. On-site with load has all sorts of benefits from a grid standpoint, but also to the extent there's storage there that helps with resilience and local microgrids and all that. Like that's a potentially fruitful area to be thinking about.
Sure. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the bill. There's a study proposed at the end, and it tries to get at the figuring out, doing a cost benefit analysis, quantifying the value stack, the energy value, plus just the kinds of things you're citing. So I think if you, it will be helpful to the committee if you review that, the terms of that study, and maybe help us fine tune that language, because that was just a first kind of rough cut. But it did get it. Things just like you're talking about.
Yeah. I did see that. I did see that study there. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. I think just thinking really carefully about what answers you want what questions you want the study to answer, and then spelling that out to say, like, we want a study that will answer the following. I would say on a purely practical basis, I put my consultant hat on for a moment. I read that scope and I think of, the back and forth and talking to stakeholders and other things or whatever, and then I look at the budget and I think, well, there are not going to be that many people who can do the work for that budget. So I know money doesn't grow on trees, but if the budget for the study were higher, you might get a more in-depth analysis.
Yeah, that $25,000 figure was just a placeholder. I think that's not enough funds to support the kind of analysis we're talking about. So since you're in the business, maybe you can just offer us sort of a ballpark figure. The other thing I'd like to vet very briefly is just that we have an ambitious timeline,
Right.
We're asking these questions and we're trying to get them back for next session.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a mid-January delivery date is practicable from your point of view, or if an RFP would have already had to be out by now.
I think it's plenty. I think it's doable, but if whoever's issuing the RFP dawdles on it for a while and takes a while to figure it out, and contracting takes an extra month or whatever, then you're pushing it. So just to the extent you would were to encourage the Joint Fiscal Office to be timely in their contracting, that would certainly work. I mean, I know they had, I don't know of any particular concerns of that with them, but just to say that doing the study well, getting ramped up, thinking about it, writing it all up, you need to at least allow 4 or 5 months for doing that. And so to the extent the procurement process doesn't start until sometime in June, and then it's RFP's open for 3 weeks, it's like it can get squashed if you don't do that part well. I admit that I have not carefully parsed the language of the study. I will read through it after and let you know if I have any particular thoughts on it. Nothing struck me when I read through it as like, oh, well, that's weird. So it's on the way there. But I can't say that I'm oh, you should change this word to that word or add a particular provision or something at this point.
Okay, well, great. If you could do that, look over, that would be helpful, since you see RFPs regularly. The other thing is that budget. So can you offer a ballpark figure? Again, the 25 was a placeholder.
Right.
I've heard much higher numbers than that since. So I know it puts you in a little bit of an awkward spot, but based on your experience with studies of roughly the scope and timeline, what would you think of as kind of a high and a low?
The scope still wants a full life cycle analysis of costs and benefits. How broad, many different people can mean different things by a full life cycle analysis. That's the thing that could be a thing that's a balloon that can blow up and down. Do you mean full life cycle GHGs? Do you mean just dollar costs? Do you mean, do you want to include the production of material? Or are you mostly interested in defining what you mean by that would be helpful for keeping the scope understandable, so that people know how to think about responding to it and budgeting for it and proposing to do the work.
So I think it's well, it just is an approximate way to talk about it. We're thinking about the sort of the deepest version of cost, like embedded costs from mining materials through production, through, not that level, but so something for us to work on and get to understand better and then be more explicit. So that will be helpful.
Yeah, but well, the thing about this kind of analysis is that once you get like, it's one of these things like just let's say rough sense. You could get a set of answers to those questions if life cycle cost is defined in a like reasonably analytically tractable way for probably 50,000. Is one of these things where it's probably doable for 42, right? It's also that you're cutting some corners, and if you can do a lot more depth and a lot more talking to people and a lot more refinement of this and that and interaction and modeling or whatever, if you're willing to go about that. So it's like you're sort of table stakes, and then you're paid for quality and depth to some degree, to the extent that you want that extra quality and depth past some point.
Okay, well, great. Well, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm figuring actually a lot of these questions are not Vermont specific questions. When you start talking about storage being associated with capacity, with generation close to load, reduced transmission and distribution losses, all those figures probably are not very Vermont specific.
So as an example of where you could go think about going deeper or not as deep is to really understand what's going on with costs on the T&D system, right? So to the extent that you really want to understand, to the extent you want to do anything on a utility by utility basis, well, all of a sudden you've got all the VIPSA members and like, so there's like, do you want utility by utility or some sort of more statewide average? Do you care about the fact that different parts of the distribution system are sort of built to different levels of capacity? That there's a bunch of data about what the hosting capacity on different feeders are and stuff like that now available, at least from across the bulk of the state. Do you need to look at like what the varying value of this kind of resources are when deployed in different places on different kinds of feeders with different levels of capacity? At some level, it's like this is where you can go. These are examples of the kind of things where you can go that little bit deeper, right?
Yeah,
you can take a high level analysis across. Here's some broad assessment of potentially a range of T&D costs that depend on feeders, right? And get a high level number and say, well, we have this many feeders at this, at this level of loading. Or you can say, well, no, actually, I want to do a more precise, or at least, more precise analysis. In order for the more precise analysis to be worth it, you need to have pretty good information, which means then you need to have the cooperation and analysis of data from utilities, et cetera. So there's some set of trade back and forth. Do you want a generally correct broad answer, or do you want to really understand what's going on a much more granular level? And that's where it can scale, scale however you like from there.
Okay, right. I'm guessing that it's very different to inject a lot of power into the GMP system than into Barton Electric.
Right, and it's going to vary feeder by feeder. If it's there's particular points there about on site with particular kinds of load. Right? So if it's on site at a convenience store, or it's on site at a residential house, or it's on site at a small manufacturer, right, or on site at a farm, like those are going to be pretty different from each other, and where those are going to tend to be on the grid are going to be different, et cetera. So there's some level of trying to work through sort of what you mean by those cases, and the more different cases of like, well, I want 4 different kinds of load with 4 different ways of running the battery on 4 different kinds of circuits. All of a sudden, you're running 64 scenarios of something, right? So really trying to narrow in on what questions you specifically want to really need to know the answers to, and ask those questions, rather than a sort of, well, it would be great to know all of this stuff.
Sure.
That you're a less focused and more expensive product.
Okay, great. Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Thank you so much, Asa, for coming and speaking to us. I'm having a little bit of difficulty following the Commerce Clause point you made earlier.
Right.
Could you go back and explain that? Because we dealt a little bit, it was my first experience really understanding the Commerce Clause when we did S5. And I didn't fully get what you were saying, and you're not a lawyer, but maybe you could explain it high level and then recommend someone to us, or perhaps we have testimony coming on that point.
And Aaron Adler, in drafting, was careful not to say instant generation. It says generation connected directly to the grid.
Okay,
I think there's no in-state, out-of-state
Right.
word.
okay.
Yeah. So
You're,
yeah. So I'm just going to sort of channel the conversations I remember having with legislative counsel 8 years ago, right? And there are questions and concerns about this, that you're not allowed to say, in this regional resource context, we're only going to give this subsidy you have to buy the stuff that comes from Vermont, right? At some level. So the question is, how do you, and unless there is some specific sort of, I don't remember what the legal language is, but there's some sort of case law and such, and Commerce Clause law around when you are allowed to say that you want it to be able to be geographically specific in terms of where it is, right, and why, right? And so the tier 2 stuff is intended to be resources that are supporting Vermont's grid, that specifically does not say that it has to be physically located in Vermont. You could imagine, in theory, building something that was in Massachusetts that was wired across the line and connected into Vermont, right? Like, so there is that aspect to it, but also that you have a sort of a legitimate interest in having the system work well where it is, and that resources that are located in New Hampshire or off the shore of Massachusetts or what have you simply cannot provide this necessary societal benefit, the social benefit that exists to the people who are using the system, because they're not connected to the right part of the system, right? So it has to be stuff that is actually really providing a benefit to the system in the state, right? And so what that benefit is, we have I think the original res language lists a number of different sort of potential benefits, or has a more general language. I forget exactly how it's crafted, but there's a reason, there's sort of a justification given for how tier 2 really is designed to be working to get the benefits on the grid that come from resources that are connected in a particular way. So to the extent then you can think about it in practice, at some point, a bunch of distributed resources all loading up on one feeder may be creating costs, not saving them in a given place. And it's harder to justify that going further and further in the direction of creating more and more costs on the grid is really the point of tier 2. So,
okay.
So finding how to shape it so that you are having resources that are providing that kind of systematic benefit, because they are adding resilience, because they are lowering grid costs, because they're distributed in a certain way, because they are providing particular non-economic, not just sort of job creation, but more specific system-wide benefits of some sort. That's the sort of the direction to think about how do you design a system. I mean, it'd be great to be figuring out how to make resources just irregardless of the Commerce Clause, right? You want these resources to be contributing, right? So figuring out how you have them be contributing resources and say you want those, right?
Okay, so thank you.
Yeah, great. Right. This seems like underneath it all, there is still a lot of engineering, and you want to be smart about what you're building, kind of thing.
The closer, the better.
Yeah. Okay.
And it
All
doesn't
right.
matter what the state lines are. That's kind of how we feel.
All right. So any other questions for Mr. Hopkins? Okay. Well, thanks for coming back as an alum.
Yeah.
And
Always a pleasure.
if you have a chance to look at the study, or I'll send our next version of that. You can just look at the study language and maybe give us a little bit of feedback on if we're narrowing it enough to be, into that practicable range.
All right, yeah, I'll happy to take a look at it.
Okay, great. Thank you again. All right. Well, with that, we will, we'll jump to Mr. Murphy.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for having me. I believe I'm here to give you some perspective on the national landscape of renewables. Most of you do not know me, so I'll probably give you 90 seconds on my company and what I do, try to make it brief. So I'm non-native Vermonter, but I am a Vermont homer. This is my place to live of choice. I've been here for about 20 years with a 6-year absence just to move out of the state and get greater exposure to the renewable energy industry. Of 17 of those 20 years, I've been in renewables. I am currently the COO for a company called Greenbacker Capital. Greenbacker is a public, non-traded company. We raise our money from moms and pops. So I wake up every morning not with a Blackstone or a BlackRock or someone's money in my hands to make them more money. I wake up with real people's money in my hands. I think that's important. It's one of the reasons that I love our company. So we are an infrastructure owner, specifically solar, wind, and energy storage. We've got just under 2 gigawatts in operation, and our total fleet of owned projects, with a significant amount of it being in the construction phase, is over 4 gigawatts, with an additional 1 gigawatt hour of energy storage, which is about 25% online, 75% in construction. We are also, by several orders of magnitude, the largest owner of solar in Vermont. It's not even close. I think that we are the largest owner of renewables in Vermont, but I'm not sure, because I'm not 100% sure about the total capacity of some of the larger wind plants. We also are very passionate about the state. As I said, we own most of the solar. We've got 25 employees, all very well paid, at the corner of State and Main, right above Rabble Rousers. I myself live on North Street, and we're continuing sort of workforce development and high-paying jobs in the state anytime we can. We are a long-term owner. I think that's important. So you probably deal with developers and legislation's developer tide, and a lot of owners like us are companies that will own assets through the tax equity period and then sell them. That's not us. We have a track record of owning assets for a long time, and our plan is to ride these assets out through the full 30 to 40-year useful life. I wanted to follow up a little bit on a few things that Peter said that I thought were important. And this is strictly from a business perspective. I'll be full on. I have not read the legislation completely. And I'm very much here as a business person giving you a business perspective. The first thing is just with RECs going out of state. I mean, I'm basically the only one buying projects in Vermont right now. Like you turn on 8 solar projects, I'm probably buying 7 of them. And the majority of deals we're seeing, RECs are still going out of state, which to me as a Vermonter is crazy. It's crazy for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's crazy that these solar programs and any programs we have are designed to increase renewable energy installations in the state. And then we're selling the renewable energy aspects out of state to make the deals work. So literally we're putting solar here, you can't call it solar because someone else is buying the renewable energy credits. That's one part why it's crazy. It seems like it's not working appropriately business-wise. Secondly, all the other states think this is nuts. Go talk to your peers in other states. They think it's crazy. Every time I bring it up, I talk to a state senator, Massachusetts, Maine, talk to business people, policy people. They all think it's nuts. Don't understand why we're at where we are today. And don't trust me in that. Talk to other people.
The sound, I'm having a little trouble with the sound. So you said, what is the thing that people say is nuts?
This ability to use out-of-state RECs for requirements. It doesn't really exist anywhere else. And you bring it up to other people, they think it's crazy because it undermines the reason why we have programs to install more renewables in our states.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks.
Second thing, just with utility upgrades, what Peter said, yeah, the utility aren't getting a direct, I pay 100% of utility upgrade costs. The utility isn't getting a direct one-for-one benefit from that, but the amount of grid regulation, the oversizing of equipment that is built into all of these things, they are getting a significant improvement for free. And if anyone tells you otherwise, they're just putting spit on it. And then the third thing, I've heard this angle about farmland. I don't think it floats. I think it sinks as soon as you put it in the water. You couldn't talk to a farmer where we own solar and lease the land from that farmer that won't give you a positive story. And most of those stories are those people are allowed to keep their land long-term and continue to farm it because of the solar array. And they're also, we don't build on prime farmland. We get all the crap land. Literally every project is on the crap land. It's all like that. So anyone telling you that we're taking away the ability to farm anywhere, even outside of Vermont, is frankly, excuse my language, BS. So I very much believe in Vermont. I will do anything to, as I said, I'm probably the only solar owner right now buying projects in Vermont. Maybe one off here and there, but it's primarily greenback. That shouldn't be. And I am sitting in a situation as a business person where I want to put money into the state. And by the way, the amount of money I put in this state over the last 7 years is upwards of $200 million, just to put it in perspective. There's nothing to buy. So I'm sitting here in Vermont where we need energy storage so that we can turn off these high cost, very infrequently used gas plants. We need, if we're going to really own what we say we should own and have in-state RECs, we need hundreds more megawatts of renewable energy, of which I will fund it. I will buy a lot of that. I want to help this state, but there's just no development. And I speak with no hyperbole in this. I am seeing more interest in developing solar and energy storage projects right now in Arkansas than I am in Vermont. And it's not close.
Okay. Senator McDonald. I don't know if you had a question.
No, this is building, and my question is, what actions should we take? And I would like the witnesses to stick their necks out, tell us what we ought to do. When the witness says our policy is nuts and don't believe him, ask people in other states. So what action should we take?
There's this cool res bill that we're talking about that we might want to do.
So yeah, you heard Senator McDonald's question. Do you have recommendations for us as a committee?
Well, I mean, I'm very much a businessman, right? So what I would tell you is we need the utilities need us. So I think an overnight turnoff of the ability to buy out-of-state RECs to satisfy mandates is not possible and is a bad idea. But some ramp of that over time that starts as soon as possible to get us off that crutch is paramount. And then the development process in Vermont is just crazy. It's crazy. Like, I am so on board with us making sure that we're taking good care of our land. The amount of distraction and unintended consequences in the development process in Vermont right now it's baffling. Like, so the direct ask is we need a reform of the policies in which we permit solar and wind in Vermont, like 100%. We need to look at everything and make sure that it is protecting our values, my values as a Vermonter and your values as a Vermonter, but isn't like overly cumbersome and will just shut down business. And I can't, just being very, very honest here, the permitting process in Vermont feels like a science experiment where the business owner that is trying to take a tight investment and make money off of it is paying for people to play with things. Like, I'll give you an instance. I have a project in Royalton. There is a very small amount of a native rare grass, blue-eyed grass on this plant. Yes. We were giving a specific set of requirements to take care of the blue-eyed grass when we bought the project. We told the ANR that you were going to kill the grass by doing what you wanted. They did not listen. We did all this crazy stuff. We spent a ton of money. Guess what? Vegetation improvements killed the blue-eyed grass. They then came back to us and said, well, we now need you to change and do a ton of stuff that costs a ton of money to now protect the blue-eyed grass that were the original things we said. And this type of thing is happening on our plants all the time, where it's just costly. To get the permitting for that blue-eyed grass was overly cumbersome, and then it's costly, and we sort of have to play by fluctuating rules. That's what is happening everywhere. And in the front end, with development of solar and wind, I will tell you right now that even the few developers in Vermont are developing more projects out of state now than they are in Vermont, because it is so cumbersome to develop projects in Vermont. So there's two things. Got to get rid of the reliance on out-of-state recs, and you got to overhaul the process for permitting solar and wind, or everyone's leaving. I mean, my competitors all tell me when I try to get them to join Renewable Energy Vermont, they say it's a dead state. It's not coming back. We're not going to be a member. That's what everyone says. And I have to twist their arms to get them to join us, which I will do because I believe in this state. But that is the current landscape.
Okay, well, it's good for us to, hear what your real world experience is on doing projects. And so you're talking specifically, for anyone who's listening, you're talking about getting certificates of public good through the Public Utility Commission, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So any committee questions for Mr. Murphy? So thank you very much for joining us, and we are going to keep on working on the res, and thanks for giving us an update from the field side of things.
Sure. If anyone ever would like to speak to us, and as I said, we're right above rabble rousers. We're here and we want to help the state. I appreciate your time very much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We have Jason Gifford on the witness list, but no show. Okay. I don't know what C Advantage is. Mr. Sterling, do you know Mr. Gifford?
It's a nonprofit think tank kind of thing. And he, Jason, was someone who did a presentation at our conference, and he has a great understanding of different renewable res type programs in all the New England states. So I think he could. So.
Okay, so we'll see if we can reach back out and reschedule, since it might help us understand our res better to look at the ones with the neighbors. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I think actually we are. So let's pause just for a minute, since we've been taking testimony. My hope still is that we will review the bill. The biggest thing that I sense that use improvement in it is the terms of the study, so that they are, it's affordable and practical time-wise, and that we ask the right questions, so that we get something useful to us in January. And so if committee members have, I'm gonna keep whatever chewing on that one and seeing if I can get stuff in writing to share with the committee, maybe tune that language up. And if that's the only thing that we really need to adjust in the bill at the moment, I would think that we can aim to vote this bill out and sooner rather than later. Maybe by the end of this week.
Right.
Because I think that's the way for us to put the concept in play. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So we didn't hear specifically changes that folks wanted to see made to the bill in any of the testimony we heard today. And I've heard conversation about some of the percentages and within, tier 1, tier 2, and kind of some changes there.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing from you is that's not necessarily a place that you'd like to explore in updating the bill. at this moment. Perhaps I'm not fully understanding that.
Yeah, well, so someone said, what's this bill about? I'd say it's about making a commitment to 100% renewable by 2032 for the grid overall and exploring our current 10% construct as well as the cost and benefits of increasing the contribution that comes from connected, I would say in-state generation to 10 and 12, 30, sorry, from 10 to 20 or 30%, there's a conversation going on. Folks are talking about, well, would we create another whole tier? People said tier 1A, stuff like that. I think, this conversation has sort of been being held off for like 5 years running. So, and I would say it's been that we've been a little bit stuck because we have had discussion about changing the in-state generation portion. But if you look at, from my point of view, if we look at Title 30, it talks about 3 things and how we, in our energy policy, it talks about least cost, it talks about safe and reliable, and then it talks about environmental impacts. So they are competing interests, and feeling like it would be helpful to us as we use that frame of reference, current statute, to say, let's know what we're talking about in terms of costs and benefits. Because one of the, I'd say, amongst all those 3 criteria, the one that I hear the most about from the utility, the department, and the PUC is the cost element. And I get it. If we're at the very time that we're trying to more people electrify more of their load, we would want to avoid the perverse disincentive of driving rates up. So there's a balancing that we know that's coming or is already underway. And so how do we make progress and not see unintended consequences of the rating?
So is
decarbonizing our energy needs in the world of transportation and heating.
So if I'm to reiterate my question, so to be clear, you're not interested in exploring any changes to that section of the bill at this point?
Well, so let me back up and say what section.
I'm happy to, well, that's kind of my question, is like what, it sounds like you're open to exploring the study being tweaked, but not necessarily the other parts of the bill.
I think that's fair.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood, because I did have thoughts on other sections of the bill, and I'm happy to go through those, but it sounds like your timeline is different than maybe a broader conversation about the res in general. So I'm happy to focus any changes I'd like to make to the study based on that feedback.
Sure. I think, I agree. There's the conversation this morning reveals to me for sure that there is a lot of things we could really analyze carefully.
Yes.
And doing a comprehensive analysis on what is our renewable energy standard. And I would like to make sure that we don't go yet another session without making no progress. And so having that study come back to me feels like it sets us up for January, which is really not very far away anymore, to then look at those revisions to tier 2, or maybe there's a tier 2 and there's a new tier that's in the middle that's regional energy as opposed to in-state energy. I don't know that.
Okay, that's really helpful for me to know. When I also think about the conversation we had around prioritizing bills that we'd like to see, well, the res is a priority of mine. I'm also very nervous that we're not going to pass out the House bills that have come our way. So I do think about those. And so I'm not going to be offering any changes to any other sections of the bill other than the study piece at this point, just to let everyone know who might be in the land of YouTube watching. Oh, and sorry, sorry, Dick, if you've been trying to raise your hand tonight.
Sorry, I missed that too. Senator McCormick.
Thanks. I found some of the testimony this morning disturbing in that the couple of witnesses kind of described our present situation as being not as good as I thought it was. And I'm not sure exactly, often the witnesses did not specifically cite this or that section of the bill as what they were talking about, but talking just about this, the system as a system. I would echo Senator White's comment that we probably ought to be looking more deeply. But if I'm understanding the chair correctly, you want to get the bill as is through now, with the understanding that we're going to do it a more in-depth exploration in January. Is that what you're saying?
That's my hope, you know, we will get information out of the study and then we'll be in a much better place. So when people have, I'll boil it down another way, people have said we should do more in-state generation.
Yeah.
And whether they call it in-state or not, it could be like regional, but and I've always said, okay, well, it will be helpful for us to have this discussion if we can examine like the pros and cons, the merits of that generation. And there is a balance that we are aiming for between these competing three criteria that we keep talking about, like cost, safe and reliable, and environmental impacts. We haven't, I feel like we're just short of data. I feel like we've been spinning our wheels for several years on the conversation. So my take on it is to say, well, let's, you know, anyone who has a perspective, let's win on merits. And the merits to me are going to be, amongst other things, at least having our facts together around costs and benefits. And because cost is inevitably a major piece of the discussion. Certainly not the only thing, but a big piece. So I don't want to avoid that. And I'm feeling like we're not equipped to have a productive conversation on costs and benefits at the moment. I'd love to see us in a better place in January. Senator McDonald.
So, Mr. Chair, when I first came to the legislature, I was put on the Energy Committee. And one of the things that happened during that was a trip up to Quebec to take a look at what was going on. And I was trying to get the date on that in 1986. My first tour of the State House. And we went up to Hydro-Quebec to look at and discuss and learn about the opportunities for purchasing electricity from Quebec. And there was discussion going on. And the people that went were Shirley Arnold from over in Addison County. We had Arnold's widow. Larry Chase, a middle of the road Republican Rotary Club member from Royalton. Myself and Alice Emmons, who was in her second term or first term, second term, as I was at that time. And we went to Hydro-Quebec and we got a presentation on what they had to offer. And Representative Arnold talked about how grateful she were to our friends at Hydro-Quebec and how that this was a good deal, et cetera, et cetera. And it was my turn. And I said, I was kind of skeptical. I said, this is it seems like a pretty good deal. And if we take it, well, it's cheaper electricity than we're buying. We were the most expensive electricity in New England. I think in our second decade of being the most expensive electricity in New England. And I said that I thought if we took this electricity, we would be happy with it. And as a result, we wouldn't have a backup plan. We would take it and we would feel that we'd made a big step forward, but we wouldn't have set sites for whatever. And the Quebec delegation, one right after another, said, no. I was being skeptical or whatever. And I listened to what they had said. And I said, I'm not suggesting that Hydro-Quebec isn't doing anything that I wouldn't do myself. if I had this power to sell. I would sell it to Vermont at these rates, and Vermont would be pleased to get it, and probably wouldn't come up with a backup plan of what to do. And I was a real popular guy for 3 days, because everybody I met from Quebec came over and told me that I was mischaracterizing the situation. And today I'm sitting here.
You're going, wait a minute.
We were 1986. That's a
Yeah,
long
that's
time ago.
almost 40 years.
The other thing was about the argument that the Inuits were being given a bad deal, and my view was maybe that's so, but if we concentrate on that, we in Vermont concentrate on that aspect, we're going to lose the great picture for the years to come, right? I thought the years to come were 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, not decades. And so, as we discussed today, what should we do now? We have, Hydro-Quebec has offered us good deals. I think one of the good deals they offered us was if we, with a conduit for their power to southern New England, they would, I think we joked about it years ago, that we would get frequent flyer miles for having been, for the value of the continued relationship we have with Hydro-Quebec, and that would help us in electric prices. And in the last 20 years, the last 40 years, we have gradually gone from the most expensive electricity in New England to the tied for the least expensive electricity. And part of that is our relationship with Hydro-Quebec. And so that's staring us right in the face. But our progress on decarbonizing is stalled somewhat, and we're not as good about. We've made a lot of accommodations over the years that would appear to be in conflict with our commitment to decarbonizing. And our relationship with Hydro-Quebec has provided us benefits and has, I think, arrested our decarbonization enthusiasm to the point of we take more credit for our forward thinking and actions than at this time in history we might rightfully deserve. And not avarice or anything like that, but out of circumstance. And that it's deeply worrying to me. So, and having witnessed this for a long time, and I don't have an answer, so I've asked the witnesses, what actions should we take? We've been, I think, rightfully criticized. Criticism is to point out flaws. We've been rightly criticized of some of our actions as they compare to our intentions. And I don't know the answer.
Yeah. So if you were to, I want to make sure I understand your worry. If someone said, so what's the worry you have with where we are today, almost 40 years in? How would you say that?
Oh, in the very beginning, we had about how we were buying credits from other states to, and all I could think of was Connecticut, Massachusetts. That's where we started with the testimony. Those are two states that won't produce their own milk, and they expect us to do it for them. And when we produce our own milk, our environment in Vermont suffers from that. You know, our lakes suffer from that. We have phosphorus and other things in part of the milk production. And when it comes to renewable energy, we are reluctant right now to produce our own renewable energy and expect customers to purchase renewable energy from elsewhere and not here in Vermont. And I just find that kind of bizarre examples of ours. Either we believe we should decarbonize because it's good for the world and we hope the rest of the world participates in it. It's good for our citizens and it should be good for our economics. We find that we're not building as much renewable energy as we had expected or perhaps hoped to build. And the question is, what actions should we take now? And we don't have an answer to that. And maybe folks do it, I'm too dense to get it. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the
Oh,
time.
no, this is a mulling over and taking in information back. So Senator Watson.
Thank you. Yeah, to your point, I mean, it does seem like a path forward would be to require more generation close to load, so to speak, right? Or regional, or whatever you want to call it. Though I totally get that making that level of change is probably going to require more time than we have. So I am happy to also have it be a part of the study so that we're ready to go for next session. That would be great. I also obviously am in favor of merging S40 with this bill. But I also think that, I appreciated the testimony that spoke to, that we want to be really clear about the kinds of questions that we're trying to answer. And I think maybe, I have certainly learned more since introducing S40. And so I think maybe we could even be clearer about here are the questions that we would like to answer through the study, both around storage and about, what kind of more renewables we're looking to add in the future, or how the mix needs to change or whatnot.
Yeah.
So that
And then we really go hand in hand.
Yes.
The biggest opportunities related to generation is storage.
Yeah.
That's my impression.
Yes, no, I agree, especially so that we're not also building, to your question earlier, of we're not needing to build more fossil fuel base, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that what we could be building simultaneously is the storage. But the other thing that I guess I do want to flag, I appreciate that the priority is let's get this done, let's move forward. I do have some questions about at least one other section of the bill.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I would love to.
You want to flag it just so we know what's sort of in play?
Yeah, so just again, yeah, just for the sake of a pin, happy to have more conversations offline about this too. But whatever makes sense. The part is on as introduced, page 2, section 2, section
The net metering.
8002. Yeah, about there's currently a 500 kilowatt cap. And this proposes a 150 kilowatt cap unless you can demonstrate that you're going to use more than that. I have heard from constituents complaints about that particular the 500 cap actually. So anyway, just to flag it, happy to learn more.
Okay, so great. Well, thanks for that. Put mark on my copy. Come back. All right.
Because that feels like the wrong direction in a way. Like we're looking for.
Well, I think that's responsive in part to the cost recommendations. So it depends really on the utility. There's some worst case scenarios where Washington Electric, they're already expensive territory to serve. They have relatively high rates. And then on top of it, if they have to pay out for basically retail rates, and they already have high retail rates, they're paying a lot more for that power than they would if they acquired it in the wholesale market. And that's a utility by utility analysis, but it's definitely, it's been under discussion for a while, and I think, so let's flag it and come back.
Fair enough. And like I said, happy to learn more, and be wrong, but thank you.
All right, so thank you, everyone. We've gone a couple minutes over. We're gonna adjourn for today. Tomorrow, because it's that time of year, we're gonna put on another hat. We're going back to the anti-degradation conversation. We have a new draft